Welcome everyone. My name is Mark Vazquez-Mackay and I want to share with you today a video on urban sketching. So we're going to talk about the materials that we use and some of the techniques. I'm going to break this video into two parts. The first part is going to be the materials, what you need to have when you're urban sketching, what's possible, and then the second video is going to be the techniques and potential use. So Welcome to the second part of my two-part video on urban sketching. Now in the first part I talked about the different materials that we use to urban sketch and sort of how to be mobile with all that, and in this video I want to do a few demos on their application for urban sketching. Now of course urban sketching, to get good at it, to get skillful at it, you have to acquire quite a few drawing skills, just sort of general drawing skills, but I can't emphasize enough the value of linear perspective. So linear perspective being sort of cubes, getting smaller as you get further away, vanishing points, all that. Start practicing a whole lot of that so that when you are urban sketching, you can do it pretty quickly. Another piece that I'd like to talk about is activating your surface. So I have another video on my channel that I refer to just as how to activate your surface for drawing, and that just means how to sort of collage and get things on there, which I do a whole lot of before I go out into the field. So for example, with my sketchbook to Guanajuato, I have stuff on all the pages where I'm just sort of like getting it ready, but maybe it's not finished yet, and then when I'm on location, I'll draw into it and sort of refine it. Or add something completely different to it. So I find that going out into the field and having this blank piece of white paper is pretty daunting. So usually I'll do something just to get it going. Now, if we don't know what colors we're going to be looking at, it's hard to sort of activate it. But if you do know what colors are potentially going to be in your subject matter, so if you are going to, a fair or something like that, and there's going to be a whole lot of bright colors, you can start just by putting down, almost at random, some various colors. So I'm just letting the watercolor bleed around and getting some interesting things happening here. I don't have to stick with the same color. If I know that there's going to be some green, it could be like that. And you just sort of get it going so that when you do a drawing over top, you don't feel like you have to work edge to edge. And these, of course, various colors can mix into each other, and you can sort of play around with it and get it moving, get some drips, etc. So starting my drawing off with something like this is going to be a lot easier. So I do, with my sketchbooks, I have a few pages that already have stuff like that. So it's already sort of activated. Now when you're out in the field, if you're not activating, what I usually start with is one of my drafting pens. So we can see the drafting pens have various sizes, right? The numbers here indicate the size of the tip. So your smallest one is going to be a 0.05. So that's what I always start with, and then I can progressively get my lines darker as I'm more confident. I like the 0.5 because as I'm drawing, my line might be wrong, but it doesn't matter too much. It's it's thin enough that I can sort of move it over, and then that initial line will be just sort of swallowed up or incorporated into the rest of the drawing somehow. So I like to start with a very thin line. I'm going to do an example here of 2-point perspective, 2-point linear perspective, right? This is your most basic sort of form, a cube in perspective. And then if you're working with your actual vanishing points and such, you would get the back of it just to sort of have a sense of the three-dimensionality of the shape. And pretty much with linear perspective, everything that you want to draw, you're going to start with a cube. So for example, when I did this drawing of my car, same thing, right? I started just with a cube, and then I carved it out and made it more and more complex. So always starting with the cube, and the cube, it could be the building, it could be the car, it could be whatever's in front of you, but you also have the ability of sort of controlling your dimensions within your page by starting off with the biggest, most simple form. And sometimes it might be, 3 buildings that you're going to cluster together into one. However you can make your drawing as simple as possible to start is good. After you have some general form, you want to block in some value and or color. So we can do this a few different ways. We can do it with with watercolor. I always like to, if I have a sky, I like to sort of get that in pretty early on. And the skies are always fun with watercolor because you can be really playful with it. Right, so you can see, sort of giving a sense of maybe there's some clouds, that sort of thing, right? So I can block in my background, my sky, with some watercolor, let that dry, and then start doing some detail. I also sometimes with my drawings like to not concern myself too much with the shape and the color being too separate. So I might sometimes even just let that watercolor go over top, right? Allowed to do that. And that can sort of take away the pressure also. In my first video I showed an example of when I went to the Calgary Stampede and just sort of got the general colors in there. Another example, I'd gone to a part of the city that had a lot of the industrial, the trains and the buildings and such. So again, I just, a little bit of blue sky, had this black because everything was really gritty, and then a little bit of red to suggest the color of the locomotives. So you can do something like that and then go in with your precision drawing, or keep going with something that's a bit more organic. So from here, you can develop it with your thin pen, or you can start to upgrade the density of your line. So this one's a 3, and when we're talking about line, we always want to think about it in terms of weight. So the thicker the line, the more weight it has. So I'm going to reserve my lines with a lot of weight for both the foreground and the bottom. Right, I don't want really heavy lines way up here at the top, because then it'll just feel like this big sort of, overdrawn form. I want to keep my lines heavy at the bottom and in the foreground so that we get the sense of something receding as it gets further away. So this is the most common way to do urban sketching, watercolor drafting pens. And so in the other video, the first video, I did share a few of the other materials that I like to play with, most notably these markers. So you can see it's got a soft tip. This one's pretty loaded right now, must have gotten squeezed a little bit. So I like this one because I can sort of rough in my values. So like I said, it's not a permanent marker, so you do have this little window of time where you can sort of move it around, right? And I can get a little bit of a range there. And then I like to couple this one either with my drafting pens, because with my drafting pen then I can sort of start to pull out the form, whatever the form is, right? Or sometimes I'll do this when I'm drawing figures, and I might sort of suggest their clothing this way and then draw their head. So this is a nice coupling. Or you can go in with your inkwell and your nib and get a less consistent line, right? So you can sort of, I think these two work very nicely together, and we can see when this is wet, this application is going to sort of bleed into it. Right, so we can see what happened just when I cross that line, whereas when it's dry, I can get something really sharp. And this ink is permanent, so that's not going to move around as I'm drawing. That is something that you have to think about with ink. Sometimes you want permanent, other times you don't. The drafting pens, the microns, they are permanent. So if I lay this down, no matter how much water I put on there, it's not going to move. So this is a fun way to draw. Another fun way is to use these, well, Copic. These are sort of knockoff Copics, and they're really good, as I mentioned in the first video, for doing shadows. So if I'm doing some architecture, maybe with one of my drafting pens, right, and I have my building, again, 2-point perspective, linear perspective, then I can use one of these grays, I actually like the warm gray, to show the side of the building. And these, you have to be very aware of the directionality that you apply it. So I'm going to apply it with the direction of the perspective. But if your building has siding on it or something, maybe you want to go with sort of the texture of the surface, something like that, right? So we can see I'm able to emphasize the directionality with the marker. And of course I can use an even lighter one to show the light side, or I can just leave it white. So these are really great for doing shadows if you don't want to get into color and stuff, and you're able to add a little bit of volume to your form by giving it a light and a shadow side, which is really important. You should always have shadow and light to describe form, right? The shape isn't enough. So those are the markers. And again, if I did want to get into, if we had like some vinyl siding, these are really neat because the more times you apply them, the more opaque it gets. So we can see where I overlap there. I can sort of give the impression of a little bit of a shadow. So those are the markers. After that, we're pretty much just only dealing with the dry materials. And the dry materials, as I said in the first video, I prefer to use if I have something organic. And you can mix all of it up, right? So you can, for example, have marker and drafting pen, and then in the background you can include some Conte, right? If you have some trees or something back there, you can have the more organic material describing or being described with the Conte. Right, so we can see we get a really nice contrast of something that feels a little bit more mechanical in its application versus something that's a little bit more organic. So we have some trees and some greenery and stuff that's all behind the building. So that is, in a nutshell, urban sketching. Do take the time, like I said, to study linear perspective and also figure drawing, because quite often in your urban scene you might have some figures and stuff, and more importantly, try not to get too tight with your application. So stuff like this, where I'm sort of just being really playful, making sure that you're using tools potentially that's going to take that away from you. And you can see when I do mine, I generally jump right into the marker. You don't have to, but if you do start with a pencil, it takes away a lot of the time and you lose some of that spontaneity and some of the freshness of working from life. So for that reason, I try to encourage people to always just go direct with whatever material they're going to use, instead of doing this, starting it off with the pencil and then going over top, because then everything just gets too rigid. So thank you very much for joining in, and please feel free to leave any comments or questions below.